Hello. 대상 강사 시리즈에 오신 것을 환영합니다. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. We will now begin this month's Embassy Speakers series. Please welcome Ambassador of the Republic of Korea to Canada, His Excellency Jo Hee-yong, for the opening remarks.
Good evening, Ambassador Lem Edwards and Mrs. Margaret Edwards and Timothy and Catherine and their fellow ambassadors and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your participating in the Embassy Speaker Series this evening. First, I'd like to express my deep thanks for your interest in Korea and for your full support for the development of bilateral relations between our two countries. As you all already know, this year is a very special year for both countries and both peoples. This year is the 50th anniversary of the diplomatic ties and 60th anniversary of Korean War Armistice. In honor of this special momentum, our two governments announced that the year 2013 is the year of Korea in Canada and year of Canada in Korea. At the same time, the Canadian government designated this year as the year of Korean War veteran. So to commemorate this double milestone, our embassy has hosted the Embassy Speaker Series to share insights and perspectives of some of the Canada's most prominent dignitaries who have long been engaged in the relations between our two countries. Today, this evening, I'm very pleased to host the first event in this meaningful cities. And today's gathering also has a greater significance. This is the first event in the Korea Week, which will take place from today until July 1st. This long week festivity aims to highlight Korea's rich history and Korea's the cultural traditions, and also deliver the deep gratitude of Korean people to Canadian friends ever since the Canadians' long engagement and then long contribution from the Korean War. Against this backdrop, I think today's topic, the 50 years and counting forging a successful future Canada-Korea relationship is both timely and relevant. I think it gives me a very valuable opportunity for both of us, all of us, to look back on our achievements over 5 to 6 decades and reflect on some events which brought us closer together and consider how to further accelerate, how to further intensify our special partnership between our two countries. Joining us tonight, we are both privileged, honored to have the esteemed Ambassador Lem Edwards, who will share his unique views and visions on the relations between our two countries. As we all know, the Ambassador Edwards spent more than 4 decades serving the people of Canada as a highly respected diplomat with various capacities, such as advisor to the Prime Minister and Deputy Minister of Defense or other departments, and also ambassador to Korea and Japan. He was also a senior officer to the APEC, as well as the Prime Minister Stephen Harper's personal representative at the G20 and G8 in 2010. Ambassador Edwards is currently a strategic advisor at Golding, Lafayette, Henderson, and distinguished fellow of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada and the Center for International Governance Innovation. I'm sure that we will learn a great deal and get various inspirations from his unique perspectives on the relations between Canada and Korea, and from his long professional career in international affairs. Welcome, please welcome to the stand, Ambassador Ren Edwards.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Cho, for your very kind introduction. It is definitely a pleasure to be here this evening for your speaker series. And when you called me, we spoke, I guess it was a couple of months ago about doing this. It took me a little while to free up my schedule this week, but I'm very pleased that I've been able to make it and to make a personal contribution to this very special 50th anniversary year in our relationship, as well as the 60th anniversary of the Armistice, and of course the beginning of your Korea Week here in Ottawa. I have to congratulate you and Mrs. Lee and everyone in your embassy for this effort in organizing these celebrations. I know from personal experience just how much work it takes. And of course the government of Korea is to be commended as well for doing this. It's the role that governments can play in a rather unique way in leading these sorts of celebrations and fulfilling the essential role not usually picked up by others. Most G8 or G20 countries often have things such as your year of Korea in countries of primary interest. So it's a terrific idea, and I'm sure happy that we're having it here in Canada at last. I'm happy as well, as you said, to be part of such an effort for Korea. Appropriately, Ambassador Cho has asked me to talk this evening about Canada-Korea relations in this 50th year. I'm happy to do so since I've been privileged to be a small part of that 50-year of achievement. In fact, starting with the 4 years I spent back in the late 70s as the head of the Japan-Korea section in what was then External Affairs, and adding in my posting to Korea in my 3 to 4 years as an Assistant Deputy Minister for Asia and APEC. I figure I've got about 10 years of the 50 directly involved in the bilateral relationship, and you can add to that a few other incidental occasions when I was a Deputy Minister in 3 different places. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the future, and I'm giving you a bit of a foretaste of this. As good as the last 50 years has been, I also intended to look ahead and challenge the notion that the next 50 years of success, that the past 50 years of success will be inevitably followed by 50 more productive years. I am in fact very worried that with the global changes we've seen these past few years, combined with developments at home, that both of our countries are in transition periods that could well take us in another direction of diminished importance to each other, and that would be a shame. But let me start by looking back. My first visit to Korea was in 1978, and my daughter, who's here this evening, was only a month old. And much to my wife's consternation, I was taken away for a trip to accompany who then was Jack Horner, our Minister of Trade, on a mission to Korea and to Japan. And what I remember in Seoul at the time was a city under curfew, soldiers at checkpoints. I remember that the windows of the Seoul Plaza Hotel where we were staying was fitted with blinds that let us look down at the square below in front of City Hall, but blocked out any direct view of the Blue House and President Park Chung-hee's residence a kilometer away. The city had a functional feel and look, buildings put up in a hurry, with little attention to aesthetics, not much greenery. But it still was a city full of bustle and hustle, shops and businesses striving to succeed to build a new Korea. I remember contributing some Canadian dollars to the cause in the Itaewon shopping district. 13 years later, I returned to Seoul, this time for a posting as ambassador. And I remember when I was asked by my deputy minister if I wanted to go to Korea for my first ambassadorial assignment. I remember being asked, and to be frank, I was not so sure. Perhaps I was a little intimidated by the prospect of taking my family to the Seoul I remembered in 1978, perhaps wondering how I would face the highly competitive environment that one found there. But I went, and for me and for my family, this was the beginning of the love affair with a country and a people that we have today. Seoul was already a remarkably changed place. The sense of city under siege had gone. Soldiers were less in evidence, although roadblocks still came out at night up near the Blue House. But this ended shortly after our arrival. The buildings were taller, and several were very striking architecturally. The trees were larger, the public spaces greener, the people better dressed at the beginnings of a fancy shopping district. It was as dynamic as ever, perhaps more so, as the economic success of 40 years was having its effect on wealth generation and confidence. The hosting of the 1988 Olympics had been a coming out party for Korea, a sign of Korea's growing importance in the world. And while I was there, I attended the inauguration of President Kim Jong-sam, which completed Korea's transition from military dictatorship to a fully democratic modern state. Now, if we fast forward to today, 22 years later, Seoul is now a world-class city, a striking architecture, the best shops and restaurants, several upscale living and entertainment districts, of course including Gangnam, the inspiration for last year's smash hit Gangnam Style by Psy. And indeed, I mean, Korean pop culture is now an Asian phenomenon and taking on the world as well. The utilitarian barrenness of the city has been almost totally replaced by pleasant avenues, public walkways, lots of green spaces. The city's historical palaces, destroyed by the Japanese during the colonial period, have been rebuilt. Tourists are flocking to this modern capital of the land of the morning calm. Now, I've taken a rather roundabout way to introduce my talk, and the purpose is really to make the point to the Canadians here tonight that Korea is no longer the struggling, developing country of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, nor even the rapidly growing but still aspiring Asian tiger of the 80s and 90s. It is now one of the globe's elite economies. The IMF ranked Korea as the world's 12th largest economy in purchasing power parity, or PPP terms, in 2012. Canada was number 13. Its per capita GDP rose from just over $2,000 US in 1980 to about $30,000 in 2010, a 13-fold increase in 30 years. It is the only developing country that has gone from being a significant recipient of international assistance to an aid donor in its own right. Many Korean companies are among the most successful in the world, with 13 on the 2012 Fortune 500 list. Canada fell short at just 11. Korea is the world's largest shipbuilder, third largest steelmaker, fifth largest automobile producer. Samsung, of course, is the world's largest consumer electronics company. Well, today, Korea is a member of the OECD, and for all intents and purposes, it's a developed country. This is a remarkable story of growth and accomplishment, and one which is now a critical factor, I believe, in defining the nature of our bilateral relationship in the years ahead. But before I talk specifically about that, let's briefly look at Canada's record. If Korea's position in terms of economic power and general influence relative to the rest of the world has been increasing, Canada's position has been one of lessening importance. We have still done very well economically as a developed country, thanks to our commodities trade, a strong financial sector, good corporate leadership, and the government's macroeconomic management, among other factors. our GDP per capita still ranks us as number 9th in the world. We have used our NAFTA and FTA ties with the United States and Mexico to build prosperity for Canadians. We've benefited enormously as a commodities producer at a time of strong global growth. But we have seen over the past decade several signs of concern, led by the decline in our share of international trade from about 5 to 2.5%. We're no longer as influential as we once were in international economic tables such as the WTO, something I've experienced personally. We're still in the G8, which has survived the creation of the G20 despite some doomsayers. But at that table, we're one of 20, not one of 8. It's not that we're in decline, far from it. But other countries are catching up and passing us in terms of weight and in terms of power. We also see this in political spheres, where our foreign policy has needed to adjust to these realities of declining influence. So as we consider the future of Canada's relationship with Korea and vice versa, we have to realize the context has changed fundamentally. The successes and main events of the past 50 years were the outgrowth of a contextual environment shaped by a developing Korea and a developed Canada. Economically, we had the complementarity of Canadian commodities to feed the growing industrial base in the Republic of Korea. In return, Korean companies began to invest in Canada's resources sectors. Koreans purchased 4 CANDU reactors as it developed its nuclear power. Canada helped Koreans develop scientific and technology flows, know-how in this and other areas. Since the early 90s, Koreans have come to Canada to study in remarkable numbers, and later large numbers of Canadians went to Korea to teach English to an internationalizing young population. Politically, Canada has given unrelenting support to the Republic of Korea in its growth and standing up to the ongoing threats from North Korea. And in the 1980s, Canadians were among those who encouraged Korean leaders to return to full democratic government, something that was much appreciated by democratic voices in Korea at the time, but I'm afraid not so much remembered today. In the early 90s, Canada extended visa-free access to Korean citizens. I was there at the time, and you know what? I encountered U.S. criticism for doing so, because they still kept the visa. Anyway, I'm sure you can name many more main events along the way in this last 50 years as you look back and celebrate. And even further back to the late years of the 19th century when Canadian missionaries moved to Korea and left legacies still active today in the religious lives of Koreans and in social and health domains. When Frank Schofield stood up for Korean students against the occupying forces of Japan and remains, I believe, the only foreigner buried in Korea's national cemetery. When, as we were reminded this weekend, Korean and Canadian soldiers stood side by side in resisting aggression and ensuring the existence today of a dynamic, free, democratic, and independent Korea. When Koreans befriended Canadians in unprecedented ways, encouraged the creation of strong economic and political ties, and came to Canada to live and contribute to this country. It's very satisfying to look back on this time of almost spontaneous growth and natural synergies. It would be nice if it were to continue that way. But as I look forward, I think that Korea-Canada relations will be defined by a strikingly different setting, which I've already hinted at. It will be one in which both countries enjoy developed status, high standards of living, and fully mature industrial and business structures. Former complementarities are disappearing. Making our relationship grow will require a new effort of discovery and new levels of commitment and effort. But what I think needs to be highlighted here as I start to talk about this challenge is something less tangible but extremely important. And that is the mindset that has developed in recent years. Let me talk about the Canadian mindset. The first thing about Canadians that is relevant to our future relationship is that many of them are, I believe, not as aggressive as they need to be in facing the global environment of the 21st century. Some are stuck with the notion that it's better to stay at home than to venture abroad, especially in abroad, that has become so furiously competitive as it has in Asia. This so-called culture of comfort means that they continue to see traditional developed partners such as Europe and the United States particularly as the primary sources of Canada's future prosperity, when we all know that the main growth lies elsewhere, particularly in Asia and including Korea. The first problem, therefore, will be to convince Canadians that they need to make the efforts to engage this new, demanding Korea in an ongoing relationship of mutual benefit. The second is that there's a strong perception among many Canadians that Korea, while enjoying the benefits of membership in the industrialized club, is still not fully open economically. They believe that the Korean state still uses regulatory and other instruments from an earlier era to favor Korean over foreign players in the Korean domestic market. I cannot tell you how many times I have encouraged Canadians, both when I was on the job and since I've joined Gowlings, to look into business opportunities in Korea, only to be told that they hear Korea is not as friendly an environment for foreign business as other places, and maybe not be worth the effort. Some of that perception is outdated, but I have to say, as I said I was going to be frank, Ambassador, some is not. As one indication, the Heritage Foundation put out its 2013 rankings on economic openness, but it placed Korea at 27th position. Hong Kong is on top, and Canada is in 6th place, which in my view is not high enough, or not low enough, depending on how you look at the figures. That will be Korea's challenge to overcome, and it extends well beyond Canada. The third contextual danger is that Canadian governments could begin to react defensively to the rise of emerging markets generally, I'm not singling out Korea here, where they see free market rules and behaviors are not, or do not appear to be, as strongly endorsed as in Canada. Now, this is a bit of an offspring to feelings, I suppose, that as Canada's power has declined, that we maybe have to rely on other instruments. It could lead to Canada taking the defensive action of putting up our barriers to level the playing field. I certainly do not see this yet as a serious danger, but sentiment is rising on this issue in some quarters. So far, today's defensiveness in trade policy terms has more to do with resistance in protectionist quarters to taking down current barriers rather than putting up new ones. The openness that Korea has found in Canada to Korean business operations and investments generally is not under threat. Let me make that clear. But I do believe, as a contextual issue, that Canadians and Canadian governments will be less inclined, as a matter of principle, to keep the Canadian economy fully open to the business interests of the big new players when they see these same players working under different rules in this highly competitive global environment. Now let me turn to Korea. Now I'm going to take correction from you, Ambassador, and Mrs. D, and anyone else here who knows Korea much better than I do. But if I'm wrong, I will take that correction. But I see the changing context in Korea creating mindsets that are different from those of the last 50 years, and which will make the challenge greater for building our bilateral future. The first mindset springs from the fact that Korea has now arrived at the center of the global economy. Its status as an economic powerhouse is recognized everywhere. This has created in Korea a justifiable sense of national pride. Korea's accomplishments are truly unique and remarkable in modern times. It's seen as the only developing country so far to have avoided the so-called middle income trap and have graduated from developing to developed status. And it opens enormous potential for the future of the country, despite the dangers still faced across the DMZ from North Korea. Canadians have to realize that these modern-day Koreans on the streets and in the offices of business and government expect to be recognized for their achievements, and that Koreans have every reason to be sure of themselves and confident of their future at a time when Canadians might be less sure of theirs. The second mindset springs from the expectations that success creates. Korea is looking to increase its voice and presence in global decision-making commensurate with its economic power. Koreans have been realizing for some time that with economic strength comes responsibility, and that this global stature requires Korea to be more than a two-issue country, more than just an Asian economic tiger with one existential security problem. In my view, Koreans are still coming to terms with what this means for Korean foreign policy and the conduct of its key relationships. For example, is there a need for broad-based relationships with key players of similar size and importance, such as Canada? Are they ready to find the win-win solutions in bilateral transactions that contribute to turning these relationships into partnerships on international issues that are lasting and durable? Are they ready to adapt Korea's traditional hard-edged approach to negotiating and the use of diplomatic and other tools to the more subtle world of middle power responsibility? This is a tough transition for any country to make, avoiding the hubris that could come from the natural result of extraordinary success, something we have seen with Chinese behavior recently, while recalibrating their interests and approaches to build the effective relationships that not only serve bilateral objectives, but also create partnerships through which they can make their new power more effective on the global plane. So, anyways, what I'm trying to set out for you is a context of change, of attitudes, of feelings, and so forth in our two countries, and how that introduces elements of uncertainty in the way we go forward. There are 2 points of understanding, it seems to me. First of all, fundamentally, Canadians need to understand the extent of the transformation that Korea has undergone these past decades. The Koreans are proud of their accomplishments and entitled to a place in global decision-making. That Koreans can be expected to flex their new economic muscle when they deal with us bilaterally and on the world stage. That it's worth the effort to build a modern relationship with Korea based on partnership, which reflects its new status as a developed country. We should stop treating them like a developing country. They're a developed country. That this partnership can have both bilaterally and internationally important dimensions, including cooperation on global governance, where Canada's expertise can be of help to Korea. For their part, Koreans need to understand that despite its relative decline in position atop the rankings, global rankings, Canada will remain within the top tier of countries throughout this century. The Canadians are proud of their accomplishments as a developed country and our role on international issues and in global governance over the past 70 years. At the same time as we welcome Korea to the developed and G20 clubs. That Canada has much to offer Korea as one of its primary partners, both in bilateral exchanges, but also as a partner on the global scene and on the management of global issues. And that for Canadians, this must be done on the same basis of full and equal engagement that Canadians have had with other developed countries. So, let me now turn to the third and final element of my talk and get a little bit more into some of the detail of what we can do together. And what it would look like if Canada and Korea and the business and other sectors in our two countries put their minds to it and manage this contextual setting that I have described. I believe, economically, that there are 3 bilateral pillars on which we can rest the future of our relationship as developed countries. Energy sector cooperation, science and technology, and, underline this, the 21st century trade and economic framework. Let's start with energy. Actually, I don't need to say much about energy, because this sector and its relationships are well known, and the potential is in full development and will expand further as we in Canada are able to get our oil and gas to tidewater for Asian and other markets. Recent Asian investments from China, Malaysia, Japan, and Korea into the oil and gas sector, led by the $14.5 billion purchase of Nexen by CNOOC last year, are proof that Canada is a sought-after destination and that there will be many takers for Canadian oil and gas in the Asian market once we get it to tidewater. As long as Korea considers Canada as a potentially important long-term source for LNG supplies and continues to invest in projects and infrastructure, the future looks very bright. If there's any limiting factor, it is that Korea will have to compete with Japan, China, and others for these resources. The overall quality of the Canada-Korea partnership across the full spectrum of our relationship will be certainly helpful to Korean interests in this area. Second area of high potential I would want to underline is science and technology. Maybe not quite in the way it's been done, certainly not in the way it's been done in the past. In two ways. One of which is that we don't have funding to do it the way it was done in the past. The second is that Korea was a technology importer from Canada in the past. But its developed status and the sophistication of its research institutions and companies have brought balance to the table and made Korea a more attractive partner for Canada. Both our countries realize research and innovation will be critical as developed economies in keeping our economies better. Working together, we can do better. We can also take on the bigger players who spend more on science and technology. And we can help each other remain competitive in terms of discovery and technological advancement. We have both common niche areas for cooperation, such as nanotechnology, and areas where one can be helpful to the other. And what I think about there, of course, is the Arctic and the cooperation that we can build in that area. Cooperation among government agencies, research, and academic institutions will encourage and underpin parallel cooperation between Canadian and Korean firms in competing in other markets. Indeed, public funding problems, as I've mentioned, will mean more private sector initiatives will be necessary. Korean and Canadian companies are already doing more to work with each other in global value chains, bringing both Korean and Canadian strengths to play, such as in transportation equipment or in construction and engineering. The third area of opportunity is trade, where we must drive forward our already extensive cooperation. We have had a very successful growing trade and economic relationship, but much more is possible. But to do so, we must bring to a conclusion the long negotiations we've been holding on a comprehensive bilateral trade and economic agreement. I know the ambassador nods on that because he agrees with me on it. We've talked about it many times, but we just can't seem to get over the finish line. If we do not complete it, well, let me start by saying that this new agreement is the blueprint for a modernized trade and economic relationship. It means some sacrifices on both sides. If we do not complete it, our two countries, frankly speaking, will be stuck with an existing 20th century framework that comes to us from the Uruguay round, which we all know is very much out of date, with each of us disadvantaged over competitors with which we have updated trade arrangements. That would be very unfortunate. If we had a new WTO agreement in the works, I wouldn't be so pessimistic, but we do not, and it's unlikely to happen anytime soon, maybe ever. I will go further to say that failure to conclude an agreement would have indirect impacts well beyond our trading relationship. There will be a sign that strategically each country does not believe the other should be among its elite economic partners in the 21st century. I think that, you have to look at the strategic results of this. It's more than simply cars, beef, and a lot of other stuff that seems to be a stumbling block. It sends a strategic message if this does not go through. It will be a sign that each country does not believe the other should be among its elite economic partners. I know this is not true of Canada, and I'm sure it's not true in Korea either, but that could be the result of failure to conclude this. We want Korea to be one of our key friendships bilaterally, and I expect Korea would like that with Canada. Well, failure will mean that the second 50 years will not be as good as the first 50, and that slowly we will cease to matter as much to each other as we focus on other relationships. I'm sorry about the dismal conclusions I have about that, but I can't come to any other. People to people. Outside of the economic area, I would suggest we put the remaining bilateral emphasis, at least main emphasis, relentlessly on building the people-to-people dimension of the relationship. Give it a solid foundation of that economic relationships should be based on interpersonal ties and exchanges. Korea's standing as a developed country means that Canada should have the same opportunities for the free flow of people between Canada and Korea as we have with other developed states. Korea would adopt and implement similar approaches to the flow of Canadians into Korea. I figure we should be ambitious about this. That would apply to education, cultural, working holiday, temporary workers, tourism, other programs and exchanges. And devote ourselves possibly in this 50th year to a new effort to expand our people-to-people dimension. Our Canadian-Korean population is at the heart of this relationship, always constantly working to improve and to bring new dimensions to it. It is proof of the value people can have in making strategic improvements with effects across all areas. Let me conclude now with some remarks about how the relationship could evolve productively in another dimension, outside the bilateral sphere, something entirely new that reflects and responds positively to the changing context of Korea's arrival as a global player. Here, rather than introducing complexities to relations, it provides an open-door opportunity. And it draws from my earlier remarks about how our now shared status as major, if second-tier players on the global scene can come into play. Some experts use the expression middle power to describe this group. I'm inclined to try and find another expression, since many countries are now claiming to middle power status, but only a smaller number are willing and able to play internationally constructive roles on international issues. There are many reasons why Canada and Korea should be partners in areas of global governance and the management of international and economic security issues. And just let me mention a few. They're kind of obvious, but I think they deserve reiteration. Commitment to democracy and democratic behaviors. Korea more recently than Canada, but we're both committed now in that area. Commitment to open market-oriented economies, although with differences on the role of the state. We are both exporters, which means we favor freer trade and have supported the multilateral trading system. And, in fact, up to the same point, we protect certain elements of our agricultural sector. So we're even like-minded in that respect. We sit alongside major powers next door, so we're very conscious of our size and relative importance and power. This has made us both strong advocates of rule-based systems as a protection against large players. We also share the objective of building effective international institutions and governance systems that prevents the rise of such a much more limited power grouping, such as a G2 or a G3 or a G5, US, Europe, China, India, and Brazil. Finally, we both have a strong attachment to the need for security and the value of international action to safeguard security. Of course, Korea feels particularly strongly about that. And of course, the UN and the use of alliances, the relationship with the United States for both of us is at the heart of it. But there are differences, of course. Differences in history and culture have shaped somewhat different views of the world, what we call Western and Asian values. Generally, Canadians have a more benevolent view of the world, shaped by our history of internal peace for a century and a half. Koreans see the world as a much more dangerous place in which to live, of course, starting in their homeland. We are a varied society in Canada. Korea is a homogeneous one. This impacts on how we react when criticized or attacked, and the role of nationalism. Let's be frank about that. But I will say that we do kind of get upset when it comes to hockey. We also have to be realistic. In some cases, the issues will take us apart or be too close to home to lend itself to close working. We need to remember that Korea will be working to enhance its role in influence, and that of other emerging economies, sometimes with consequent implications for lessened Canadian voice and influence. Koreans will have to realize that we bring a Western developed country view to the table, and we are working to retain our influence and power in global decision-making. Now, while differences can make it more difficult to cooperate, when we do cooperate, it can have more impact because we speak from two historical, cultural, and geographic perspectives. I see cooperation between Korea and Canada is possible in several areas. In world economic governance, making a success of the G20. We did that in 2010. and speaking truth to power and dealing with the major players, especially the United States and China. In the world of international financial institutions, making the IMF and the World Bank governance bodies and decision-making more reflective of the strength of the emerging economies. In trade, supporting the WTO and the multilateral rules-based system through its current doldrums, and incidentally, completing our own trade and economic agreement. In security governance, a reformed UN Security Council that does not become the preserve of old and new major permanent members, all with vetoes that marginalize the rest. In regional affairs in the Asia-Pacific, to make sure the region continues to have governance structures that effectively engage the attention of the major players, China, India, Japan, and USA, that remains democratically managed and open to the outside. To work to manage the competition between a rising China and the United States, and create and channel behaviors in peaceful directions. To help deal with security issues, both traditional and non-traditional, in the Asia-Pacific region. And I'm pleased to say we're working at CG with Asan Institute on a project on this very subject. Strategically, Canada needs new, non-military allies and confidence to work with internationally to solidify its place. And as it consolidates its new place at the big tables, as a second-tier power, Korea needs allies too. And what better one than a country that has been there, that shares a common view of the governance challenge, and with which Korea enjoys such a good historical relationship. So it's time for me to conclude these rather lengthy remarks. I believe firmly that Canada and Korea can forge a second 50-year relationship even more productive than the impressive history we celebrate this week. But it will not be easy. It requires some resetting of our traditional views of each other and adapting to some new realities. The power relationship has changed fundamentally between Canada and Korea. In power terms, it's now a relationship of equals. In content, it needs to move from a relationship between developing and developed countries to one between two developed states. If both sides can accept these facts about each other and themselves, then it should be possible to shape a new relationship along the lines I've suggested. It has to move to mindsets, including making the mindsets where opposition is put aside and we're making concessions that are needed by both to secure our future trading relationship. It could consist of three solid economic and I would say interrelated pillars. A modern, high-level trade and economic framework that facilitates major enhancements in business activity between two developed countries. Second, a solid understanding that Canada would be a long-term supplier of energy and other commodities to Korea. Third, growth in private and public cooperation in the field of science and technology as one would normally find between two sophisticated developed economies. This would be underpinned by a more intense, open people-to-people interchange, special programs and travel, again typical of what we have with our other partners in the developed world. And finally, a major new dimension would consist of Canada and Korea working together and with others of like mind and capacity in helping the global community deal with the international governance, economic, and security challenges of this century. And if we do these things, and do them right, then perhaps 50 years from now, our successors can have another celebration like this. We'll have to wait and see. Thank you very much.
감사합니다. Thank you very much, Ambassador Edwards. We will now proceed to a Q&A session. So if you have any questions for our speaker today, please raise your hand and I will bring you a mic to pose your question.
I don't have a question as much as
If you could please introduce yourself.
I usually when I have a mic in front of me, I start first time I was singing, but I'm not going to insult your ears tonight. I don't have a question, Ambassador Edwards. I just have a sincere thank you for a wonderful, wide-ranging, and at last, a presentation that you have given us that is free from the burdens of high office, which is just wonderful and a delight in every single respect. If I take anything from your wonderful presentation, it is some kind of a triangle composed of mindset, democracy, and education. If we in Canada were to pursue our future relationship with Korea, and by extension with Asia Pacific, I really think that the positive assessment you gave potentially for the next 50 years is going to become reality. Again, thank you very much.
Do we have any other questions for our ambassador? If you could please introduce yourself.
I'm Bob Lee. I was the first resident trade commissioner in Korea, but I was also director of the Science and Technology program for 4 years when Mr. Edwards was the deputy minister. And at that time, science and technology agreements were not in vogue, and we had an arrangement with Korea. But right now, I understand the arrangement has expired. Do you know, does the lack of a science and technology agreement with Korea, will it affect our relationship, or do you think we've risen above that and that business to business is really the way to go? Or do government science and technology agreements mean a lot in the Canadian-Korean context?
That's an interesting question, because it's an interesting question because I think you touched on two different systems in two different countries. The agreement is probably needed to free up funding in Korea. It's not needed in Canada because there's no funding to free up. And even if there were funding, I don't think we technically need the agreement. I think there's just two different approaches in our two governments. But the point I want to make is, irrespective of that, I'm always good at making pronouncements about what should be, and maybe less good at figuring out how we're going to get there. But I do think that what I'm trying to say is that we need to develop these relationships at the corporate level, and that the same way that our companies and our governments and our research institutions work closely with Europeans, with the United States. We even do things with Japan as developed countries where there is when two voices are talking and they both are talking about the same thing and they know what they're talking about, that we should be able to do the same thing with Korea. And that I think this door can be opened very safely now, and it should evolve, I think, simply as a commercial necessity and an economic necessity, because we all know that unless we can maintain our edge, our innovation, ability to innovate, both Canada and Korea are going to fall down those ranks. We're not going to be up there at 12 and 13. We'll start slipping backwards. So it's extremely important that we continue to maintain our innovativeness, and by working together, we stand a better chance of succeeding.
My name is Margaret Kim, and I'm a JD student at the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law. Ambassador Edwards, thank you so much for providing a view that's a liaison between Canadians and Koreans, and really identifying what the gap is in between the two nations. My question for you is, you've mentioned that the Heritage Foundation statistics ranked Korea as 23rd in its openness. What do you think are some of the factors in their ranking that Korea could improve? But if you could identify some of the factors as to why the ranking may be not as high as where Korea would like it to be. It would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Well, you're asking a tough question since the Heritage Foundation didn't give any list. But I think it's, the sorts of things that they're looking at have to do with the transparency of the marketplace, the extent to which when businesses move into a jurisdiction to set up shop, there are regulations that are clear. There are not too many of them. You don't have to go through 500 steps to register a business. You can do it in 2 or 3 steps. When you do a business, the government tax collector doesn't come knocking on your door and tell you that you owe more tax than the domestic firm down the road, that you're taxed at different rates. I mean, there's all sorts of hidden, I would say, and informal barriers to business activity. I think those are the sorts of things. I think corruption is also an issue. I'm not saying that's an issue in Korea. I'm just giving you some of the factors that I think are that feature in these rankings. So going back to what I said about the general perception of Korea in Canada and a number of places is it's hard to do business in Korea. That Korean businesses have the inside track, and that to compete with foreign companies find it very difficult to compete with Korean companies. I think part of that is lack of effort, but the image once created is hard to break, and so people are simply frightened away by the image. So I would say that that one of the challenges that Korea faces as now a developed country is to take care of some of these issues, because it will be expected of them. And I know that you've completed an agreement with the EU. You're about to start one. Well, you haven't one with us. You probably are going to be doing something. You've done something with Japan and with China. Now, maybe there won't be a lot of pressure from that direction to kind of open up the business sector. But if you, for example, were to join the TPP negotiations, I expect that's supposed to be a high ambition agreement, and there'll be a lot of pressure to do some things there. So I think as time goes by, Korea will find itself obliged to take care of some of the factors that have contributed to this rather low rating.
Right here.
Ambassador Edwards, Maria Shin. I think we met before. I produce movies. And I'm keenly following the developments, especially the recent talks between President Obama and the new president of China around the intellectual property issues. In terms of your views going forward, the future and innovation, and Canadian policy around knowledge-based economy being, from my understanding, critical to Canada's own future, where do you see potentially Canada and Korea relationship vis-a-vis intellectual property and openness, if you like?
Well, I'm no expert on IP, so I'm going to hedge my comments by saying I don't know in detail the domestic situation in Korea. But I do know that Korea has become a real champion for strong IP standards. In fact, I know that last autumn Korea was the host of the World Congress of Intellectual Property Lawyers. And I know a few law firms in Seoul that make this one of their main lines of business. So I think that generally speaking, again, it has to do with Korea's evolution to being a developed state, that the protection of IP is extremely important now. I mean, when you have a leading electronics company in the world trying to maintain its edge, believe me, its IP is extremely valuable. And I expect that this is the case for all major companies in Korea now doing business and on the edge of technology development in cars or electronics, ships, you name it. Now, of course, the IP rules in Korea again, I'm no expert on exactly where they fit. My sense is that we in Korea are in about the same place. The Americans are trying to drive a harder bargain on IP. They want to increase not only WTO TRIPS standards for intellectual property, but they want to drive it into a new zone. And you'll know that they have just finished a deal with Korea, which they regard as state-of-the-art on IP. They would like to use the Chorus agreement as the standard in the TPP. So that tells me as well that Korean IP is a pretty high level of protection. So I, for one, wouldn't worry too much. Therefore, if we get into a more intensified science and technology relationship with Korea, Canadians, I don't think, need to be concerned, as they once were, that basically it was a one-way street of technology moving from Canada to Korea. I think now that this street is a two-way street and will be managed on a commercial basis.
My name is Subin Park. I'm a professor emeritus at Carleton University. Let me echo my colleagues by saying that I really appreciate your sharing your thoughts and insight into the bilateral relationship between Canada and Korea. I have a little question to ask you this way. I forget when the bilateral talk between Canada and Korea on FTA started many, many years ago. And I feel as if the issue of FTA is put on the back burner by both countries. Would I be able to see an agreement to reach it in the near future, let's say 3 years, 5 years? Mm-hmm. And if so, what are the main issues on this problem? Thank you.
Well, that's a question. Well, let me see, Mr. Park, if I can answer it without taking another hour of anyone's time, because it's a complex answer, and maybe the ambassador will help me out if I get into trouble. They started in, I think it was 2006. Got off to a good start, but then got bogged down, and there were, I mean, the two basic issues, as I understand them, are the demand by the Korean side for access for Korean automobiles, in which case looking for lower duties, if not elimination of duties on imports of Korean automobiles. And then on the Canadian side, it's agricultural products, it's particularly beef and pork and these sorts of things. And the talks simply were going nowhere, and they were put on hold. I do believe that at one stage there were opportunities to get them going again, but the Canadian side was not so keen at that point, and they did not get restarted. They have been restarted now for, what, a year or two, and that they have moved forward and had been moving forward over the last year quite well. And indeed, around the turn of the year, there were some very hopeful signs that we might be able to finish it up. I wrote a piece last fall where I was worried that things were not going anywhere. And not because I wrote the piece, but because everyone came to the same conclusion. Things started to happen, and there was a feeling that perhaps the deal could be done even by the end of President Lee's tenure. This was not possible, and when President Park came in, there's been a hold put on the talks, in part because of reorganization of the Korean bureaucracy. The trade function has moved from the foreign ministry into the industry ministry, or the commerce ministry, and in the course of that, that has had impacts on the ability to conduct negotiations. And I suppose you might say that the tone, by moving trade negotiation from one ministry, which is normally outlooking and tends to be more liberal as view to a domestic industry, that there may be some consequential changes in terms of interest in completing the agreement. Nonetheless, I gather that they are now back talking, and we will see what happens. I don't think, a very personal view, that we can wait 3 to 5 years. I think it's got to happen very, very quickly. Korea is moving on to a negotiation with China. That's a big, big deal, as you can imagine. So there's no real time to worry about the Canadian relationship. We're moving on to starting to throw very significant resources at the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiation. We're trying to finish up with Europe, another kind of thing that's stumbling a little bit right now. But I'm worried that if we don't get it done, let's say by the end of July, that we will, I think we may just drop out, because I think that you got to, once the momentum begins to give on something like this, it can be fatal. And as for the issues, I think there's the 2 main issues.
Okay, one last question. At the back.
My name is Sanjugo, working at Korean Embassy here, First Secretary. So as you know, is one of our policy priority under current Korean government is that Korea should be a responsible middle power contributing to international peace and security and prosperity. And usually these middle powers tend to play a quite important role in the international arena, especially in the multilateral diplomacy. But it seems to me that the current Harper government of Canada, just their foreign policy based on economic realism. And some people saying that they are just showing some contempt toward multilateral diplomacy. So how do you think these two government policies reconcile with each other?
Well, I don't think they're necessarily against each other. Mr. Harper's government, of course, has played, and I was part of that. The role that I had before I retired was very much on international economic issues around the G20 and so forth, and the reforms in the IMF and the World Bank, financial regulatory reforms, the work that was done at the time, the height of the crisis, to try and insert more capital into global markets and ensure that there was businesses and countries, particularly, weren't starved for capital requirement, the capital they required. So I think that if you look at the economic side, Mr. Harper's government has been very active internationally in any number of quarters, but principally the G20. And we have worked closely with Korea in the G20. I made that point in my speech. And I was working with Lee Chung-yong, who was the Korean Sherpa at the time, who's now the senior economist, chief economist at the Asia Development Bank. We worked very closely through our year and through 2010 to have back-to-back summits that were well coordinated and so forth. So there's already a living and an important example of Canada and Korea working together as middle powers, if you can use that term. You can in this context, although, as I said in my speech, the definition is a little woolly right now, and I would prefer something else. I don't know what that something else is. So we have worked in the economic sphere. In the area of security, I think that there's potential there too. I wouldn't say that, what does multilateralism mean? If it means the United Nations, and I don't think it does in all cases mean the United Nations, you may have a point in the sense that Mr. Harper's government has not been as fully engaged in UN activities as earlier governments. And we are not seen, the country is not seen as being sort of engaging in sort of the UN context. But there are other contexts as well. NATO is a context in which we have been doing work. And the NATO alliance has worked with non-NATO countries, not with Korea, although Koreans have been present in Afghanistan in non-combatant roles, as I recall. So, and we've also, we're now talking about doing things in Asia together. And again, that won't be under any UN flag, that will be through things like the ASEAN Regional Forum. It could be confidence building worked out, it could be participation in joint exercises. RIMPAC, for example, is one area where we could be doing more. We could also pair up with Korea and maybe one or two other countries to do everything from headquarters exercises to actual naval exercises. So and we can work together on disaster relief. We can work together on anti-piracy. And those are in the field action-oriented steps that we can take to work together to contribute to a safer, more secure world. So, and all of those things are well within the ambit rather of Canada's foreign and defense policy as carried out by this government.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Edwards, and thank you very much to everyone for participating in the Q&A session. We will now present our speaker with a commemorative plaque, followed by a brief answer.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Forward? It's okay. Going on this. Okay.
Perfect.
One more. It's okay. Okay. One more time. Yeah.
At this moment, we would like to kindly ask you to remind you that we have evaluation surveys for this session of Embassy Speaker Series, which are available at the bag or at the registration table. I'd also like to make two announcements, one of which is the Korea Week events that His Excellency Ambassador Cho mentioned. Today is the very first event of the Korea Week. You can find more information at the registration table. We have brochures available. The next announcement is that I would like to take this opportunity to announce the next Embassy Speaker Series, which will take place on Wednesday, July 10 at 6 p.m.